pleading with you to respond. Okay, I'm glad I am finally connected. Hey, everybody. Luckily, today there's really nothing else in the news that's distracting you from what's going on. You're going to be totally focused on World War One. This is the making of modern America. Hi, everybody, and welcome to World War One. As I said before in class, um, I'm sort of interested in economic history, financial history, and that sort of stuff. And this is going to be the strangest World War One lecture you've ever heard, I would bet, because my way of thinking about World War One is it has a lot more to do with weed and ideas of empire and technology and things like that than maybe the traditional World War One history. And it's one that's focused not so much on France and Great Britain, but some of the other players that I think are maybe even more important. So bear with me. Let's last class we talked about how we need to really think about this as a world of empires in the period leading up to World War One, and it's not just the French Empire, not just the British Empire, to the extent that the United States is an empire, it's not just the U.S. empire. There are other empires that are really important to understand: the Ottoman Empire, the Qing Empire, the Russian Empire. And we'll be talking about those empires in the context of Britain and some of these ideas that we've been talking about civilization and barbarism and stuff like that. So I want to talk about then some of the changes that are taking place. And to start with, I want to talk about, use Walter Bagehot. That's the way you pronounce his name. He was the editor for The Economist, which was a free trade magazine in Britain, probably the most influential magazine in the English language in the 1860s and 1870s. And he's the person who, and in the period of Pax Britannica, remember 1815 to 1914, probably the single most powerful intellectual, if you will, in the period of Britain's rule. And Bagehot argues very much like the other Herbert Spencer, Herbert Spencer, we talked about before, remember the idea of the survival of the fittest and stuff like that. Herbert Spencer actually worked for Walter Bagehot on The Economist magazine. The thing about The Economist magazine is that nothing is, in The Economist, has an author named in it. And so Bagehot and Morgan wrote, Bagehot and survival of the fittest guy, were friends and colleagues and wrote together about this. So Bagehot argued that ancient societies had created what he called a cake of custom, or hereditary drill. Cake of custom is a funny word. It's a phrase that's coined by Bagehot, and it means this the sort of thing that you're used to in a society that's ancient. So it refers, actually, I think, not to the like a piece of cake that you would eat, but actually the kind of cake that you would feed to a cow, which was commonly fed to cows in Britain. And so the cake of custom is basically what people were used to and understood, the hierarchy that they understood. And he said that there was a cake of custom in the Oriental world, in places like China and Japan and India, but also in the Middle East, that there was a way in which you just basically obeyed your masters. Some people use this term Oriental despotism, and that these people obeyed their leaders without question. And so the term kowtow, for example, is taken from China, and it's when you do something awful, you're supposed to bow, not completely, all the way with your head down. There are a whole lot of other kind of stories about the East and the exotic East in which people have absolutely no rights. And this is what Bagehot is talking about. He said Oriental and Eastern empires have been driven by fear of change to maintain particular groups with control over trade, land, etc., and that people were kind of locked into this system. Now, is this true? Not really. But it's sort of a myth, but it's one that's, it doesn't, there are features of it that kind of resemble things that are going on in this world. So I don't want to say it's entirely a myth. But it doesn't really describe the Ottoman and the Qing empires at all that well. They're not trapped in the past exactly. They were changing in many ways. When, in fact, one of the things that surprises Britain when in the Opium Wars in the 1840s is when they kind of come into China. One of the first things they discover is that there's all this corn, American corn, that's being grown in China in the 1830s and 1840s. It's not like they're disconnected from the rest of the world. They're following what's going on in the rest of the world, but they don't really want Britain to import goods on their own terms. They want tariffs. They want the Hong merchants to control things. Bagehot believes that this is just sort of Oriental despotism at work, and they need to break the cake of custom. And that means with gunboats, and that means with machine guns. And that's what the Opium Wars that we talked about last on Monday were. Just let me back up for a second to say that there are all these internal conflicts going on in China. The Taiping Rebellion that follows after the Opium Wars. In the Ottoman Empire, likewise, there are Balkan states that are separating off, like Greece and Romania and Bulgaria. It's not like these people are immune to change. They're facing, in some ways, more radical change than Great Britain is facing. But as Britain and other states, European states, saw it, they needed to break the cake of custom by forcing their way into the markets of Asia and the Ottoman world. And it doesn't always work. As the First Empire, Opium War in the British is a victory, but the Chinese learn from this in some ways, and they basically go back on the treaties after 1842, and then Britain comes back in 1856 a second time with more gunboats and more soldiers. And in 1856, there's American and French and other folks that are coming along to watch this invasion and to participate and help. The Americans actually do help in this Opium War, the Second Opium War, providing naval support for this invasion. And it doesn't actually work that well. It doesn't work as Britain. Remember that Jacob Hall and others were talking about how brutally, basically that this is just a joke for the British Navy. The British Navy, remember, invades, they shell, they send a few troops on, they attack a city and they burn it to the ground. That's what happens in 39 to 42. The Chinese actually learned quite a bit by 1856 and 57, and the British, it turns out, are actually pretty crappy at amphibious landings, as we'll see when we talk a little bit more about World War I. And so initially when they try to get up to, Beijing, towards Beijing up here, when they get near to Tianjin and they try to attack Tianjin, they're somewhat successful at shelling it. But by this time, the Chinese have adjusted their readouts and things like that, so they understand where the British are going. And then when they try to land amphibious troops, the Chinese are prepared for them. And in fact, they kind of lure the amphibious troops, these soldiers, onto the soil, and then they wipe them out. And the British soldiers are wiped out in 1860. And as a result, the last part of the Opium War, the Lord Elgin, this is James Bruce, the 8th Earl of Elgin, Lord Elgin, orders the destruction of the Summer Palace in Beijing in the Second Opium War of 1860. And even Lord Elgin, who's at the head of this military expedition, he believes in the sort of breaking of the cake of custom, as I said, but he worries about what he's done. He says, whose work are we engaged in when we burst thus with hideous violence and brutal energy into these darkest and most mysterious recesses of the traditions of the past? So he sees them as being locked in the past, but he's kind of horrified by the brutality of the destruction of the Summer Palace, the kind of wiping out of this massive palace and the destruction of all these buildings and things like that. So in this context of breaking the cake of custom, this idea that the rest of the world has to be kind of introduced to free trade and open trade with the rest of the world, what we see is this sort of scramble for empire. And I've talked a little bit about this In China, it's the carving up of China with these treaty ports that basically any Europeans, British, French, German, even Swedish and American troops are allowed to, traders are allowed to land. They're protected. They're protected by their own, they have their own rules in these treaty ports. Their own national laws work there, not the Chinese laws work there. Likewise, in the Ottoman Empire, if we look here, what's happening is Britain is sort of taking over what they call spheres of influence. Yeah, what is free trade in this context? Free trade in this context means China can't say we're not accepting opium. China can't say we're not accepting telescopes or any of these other gewgaws that the British provide. We only want silver. So previously, when the Chinese are trading, they say we want silver. We'll take some gold. We'll sell you tea, but that's it. Nothing else. And free trade in the context of the way the British viewed it is not only can we sell these things to, but you can't impose tariffs. Or if you do impose tariffs, they have to be very minimal. So you can't block any British goods from coming into these regions. So that's what free trade means in this context. It's a kind of a funny term because Britain itself is not really free trade in this period. Britain itself imposes all sorts of regulations on goods coming into Britain. But it's a term that the British throw around, really. And so what they have then are zones of influence with treaty ports and things like that in the Ottoman Empire. So really not free at all. No, China basically has to have free trade. Britain itself is going to have free trade in grain, but not in that much else. Yeah, and so we're trying to get access. The U.S. and the rest of Europe is trying to get access to Chinese goods and others. Tea, porcelain, silks. Those are the big ones. And this trend really goes on until the 1880s and 1890s. Europe doesn't have all that much that China wants, but gradually in the 1880s and 1890s, what we start to see is things like eyeglasses, which are new, kerosene oil, and grain that start to come in. And it turns out that the United States is actually a better provider of some of those goods than Britain. Britain doesn't have necessarily a whole lot that China wants even after the ports are opened up. Grommet. So Wallace and Grommet. The British people are drinking an insane amount of tea, and they've actually got a balance of payments problems with China because of this. And the Opium Wars is basically a way to create a trade where British-controlled India sends opium to China. China buys the opium, and in return, it sends out tea and porcelain in return. And so Britain is not forced to send all sorts of silver and gold to China. That's the way that Britain views it. But it is free trade in the sense that there are all these things that were barred by the Chinese, and there were all these very high taxes that were imposed, lots and lots of regulations that were imposed by the Chinese. And so the British sort of object to all these regulations. Now, what's important to understand, this is both before and after the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal developed by the French in 1868, 69, taken over by the British in 1870 and 71. And the Suez Canal is really a lot about access to India and access to China. Okay. So even the thing that's important about this quote unquote free trade, as Chris is saying, and her question, is that what happens is that basically very quickly these empires, the Qing Empire in China and the Ottoman Empire, become in debt to Britain and to Europe generally. And so what the Europeans do is they even collect taxes inside the empire. That's what free trade means in this context, is basically there are two institutions, Ottoman Public Debt Administration and the Chinese Maritime Customs Service. And they are basically organizations inside the Ottoman Empire that tax things like tobacco and coffee and other goods like that. And Chinese Maritime Customs is goods that are trading back and forth along the Yellow Sea inside China itself. And they are actually taxing them. These are European agents, and you can see here the British agents here at the Chinese Maritime Customs Association. Ottoman Public Debt Association is British, French, and German, but mostly British and French agents who are collecting taxes inside the empire for kind of sin goods like tobacco, cotton, tobacco and coffee, and these taxes are being collected inside the empire, and what they're used then is to pay off debts. So the Ottoman Empire increasingly has more and more debts to Great Britain and other countries. It's issuing bonds, it's trying to build railroads and things like that. It has debts to those countries. The debts are actually being collected by Europeans inside the empire to pay off those bonds. Does that make sense? Henry, I'm not sure what you say when you say it's misleading. It's the idea of the term is misleading, or the agency itself. It's important to understand that there's been a lot of history written of these two. Oh yeah, right. They're taxing to repay their debt, so they're taxing internally and externally. They're basically enforcing these debts. No worries. There are so the Ottoman Empire has a tariff, but it's very low. After 1820, the British impose a tariff. It's very low. It's at 10 to 15% on all goods coming into the Ottoman Empire, as opposed to 50 and 60 and 70% depending on the goods previously. It imposes this really low tariff, but that tariff that's collected by the Ottomans is actually collected by French and British folks who are at the ports, sitting in the ports. And the thing that's disturbing about this is that nobody really knows if they're getting if they're fully paying off, if the debts are actually if more is being collected than the Ottoman Public Debt Association and the Chinese Maritime Customs and Service charge. In fact, it's probably true, certainly in the case of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, that it starts around 1873 when when the Ottoman Empire goes bankrupt, and it's probably paid off all of its debts by about 1890, given the tremendous amount of money that's flowing through the Ottoman Public Debt Association. But they continue to collect. They continue to collect, and the people who are connected with the debt association make tremendous amounts of money. But then they basically have two books. One book is what they're charging people. The other book is what they say they're charging people. And so basically elites who are connected to these taxing agencies inside the empire are making money hand over fist. This is a little bit like, I don't know, imagine, I grew up in Florida, and there were supposed to be, when you take the interstate, there are all these interchanges that charge you a toll roads that are established. And this plan in 1980, when they started, was that they would pay themselves off in 1990. But for some reason, once you get a taxing agency, once it starts developing itself, it's never done taxing, right? And so even in 2020, when you drive through the Beeline Expressway or one of these other toll roads, you're still paying tolls, even though they're supposed to have been paid off 20 years ago. And so this is it's a sort of self-perpetuating taxation system, European controlled, inside the empire. And it arguably drains those empires dry. That's what the Chinese say, that's what Turkish scholars say, and that's what American scholars who study these agencies say. Is they basically agree that it's basically a kind of taxing structure inside the empire that drains those empires dry. Does that make sense? What this does? So depending on your perspective, it certainly breaks the cake of custom, as Bagehot wants, but it breaks it in a way that actually starves the empire of resources and starves these states of resources. Okay, so what we get is European spheres of influence, as I said, in the Middle East and China, where Europeans can set the rules on trade in ways that favor them. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about Russia, because Russia is important if we want to understand the coming of World War I. Even more important, I'd argue, than Germany or France or some of the other stories. So a little bit about Russia. Russia was regarded by Bagehot and by European states as half civilized. So remember that this is autocratic which means undemocratic imperial Russia. The monarch has absolute power over everything. Um, Even landlords, even factory owners, even very wealthy people inside the Russian Empire have almost no say, and there's no vote at all. There's not a Duma for most of the time that Russia is from, say, from the beginnings of the Russian Empire all the way up until 1910. There's nothing like a governing body. It's basically the emperor has absolute control, and he demands for the nobility. Nobility are obliged to serve in the army or the navy, and if they don't serve, if they refuse to serve, then they lose their titles of nobility, and the land is taken back by Russia. So it's absolute control, and that's the kind of thing that Bagehot is disturbed about, is that people are basically listening to these imperial rulers without any checks and balances. Uh, it's in this period that after the 1881, after the assassination of the Emperor Alexander II, is that right? After the assassination of Alexander II, the Okhrana is formed. And the Okhrana is an organization, it's a secret service that gets a tremendous amount of resources inside Russia, that spies on and kills opponents of the regime. It assassinates them, even in France, even in Paris and Germany and elsewhere. It's a secret organization that sort of has its kind of fingers everywhere, and it literally kills people that it believes are a threat to the Tsar. The Russian Empire has an army that's incredibly hierarchical. The British army, by comparison, is you're not buying your position in the British army in the way you used to before the 1770s. The Russian Empire, though, everybody who's an officer is basically in the nobility, and they to be a soldier in the Russian army is awful. And in fact, in the 1870s, when lots of other people are dragooned into the war, that's into the army. That's when lots and lots of people start to leave Russia, sometimes illegally, to come to the United States. Lots of people in Kansas, Nebraska, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio are it's basically escapees from the Russian Empire because of the demand that these people be drafted and fight for these imperial officers, who are very likely to whip and beat soldiers who don't do what they say. It's so just the Russian Empire is not a very I don't want to say it's an Oriental despotism, because that's really the 19th century language, but it is a sort of somewhat despotic regime, I would say. So that's Russia at the top. Russia at the bottom is incredible disparities of wealth. A system where serfdom ends in 1860. So just at the same time that just around the same time that the U.S. abolishes slavery, Russia abolishes serfdom, and so you're no longer obliged to work for a master or a lord on a regular basis. But you have to pay for that. You actually have to pay for it. You're supposed to be able to get land, but you have to pay for your freedom over a period of years, and this goes all the way up to 1881. People are still paying for their freedom in this environment. This means that there's lots of poverty, lots and lots of things that could be done by steam engines and other equipment are basically done by hand women dragging timber, across rivers in this period. Incredible starvation and poverty there. Russia is exporting an insane amount of grain in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and yet there are famines in Russia in 1891 that kill are about 4 to 5% of the total Russian population, mostly in these areas that are grain-producing areas. So this image up here at the top is on the right is basically soup kitchens that are established for Russian peasants in 1891, at a time when Russia is exporting a lot of grain to the world, competing with the United States to export grain, at the same time that there are just tremendous poverty. You also have, the other thing the Okhrana is doing is they don't kill everyone who's an opponent of the regime, but if you're in a family of somebody who opposes the regime, you're very likely to end up being exiled to Siberia while you work as an enforced laborer for long periods of time. Yeah, they are doing the labor by hand to generate income to pay off serfdom, and the rates that would be cheaper. Yeah, that's part of it. The other thing is basically the same problem the American South has, that you don't have a lot of engineers who can maintain these. Steam engine's awesome if you have somebody who can make sure the steam engine works. But there aren't a lot of people. There's very little educational institutions, very few educational institutions in Russia. The educational institutions in Russia are limited to mostly the aristocracy. Some Jews were allowed to get educated in the 60s and 70s, and then in 1881, after the assassination of Alexander II, the May laws basically prevent Jews from being able to be educated. So there are a lot. Illiteracy in Russia is 85%, something like that, 89%. Most people are illiterate. There really aren't public schools in Russia until very late, say the 1890s. So there's really no industrial skilled labor. That's basically true. There are attempts to build factories and things like that, but it's unskilled industrial labor. Yeah, the western part is definitely more industrialized and more modern. I'd say the western and the southern parts. So the area around Odessa on the Black Sea is, let me see if I can find an image for a second. Yeah, so this area in sort of southwestern Russia in Odessa, people call that the Russian America, and it does have lots of private ownership and lots of land, and that's where a lot of the grain is actually literally coming from this. And then also, let's see, Petersburg has some industry, but there's a lot of industry here, actually just off the map in Baku, where the oil fields are. So Jake is asking, were the pogroms connected to the May laws? The first pogrom is, so let me just say something about what a pogrom is. A pogrom is from the Russian word grom, which means thunder. Okay? And a pogrom is the thunder of the Cossack horses as they move into Russian areas and basically raid these Jewish areas. What people follow the Cossack horses holding banners with pictures of the Tsar on it, or images of the Tsar, not pictures, but images of the Tsar, and they break into Jewish houses, they beat up Jews, they burn these regions. So the first pogrom in Russia, I think, is in 1871, and it's actually in Odessa. You could argue that pogroms go way back, but something that looks like that, what I've just described, with the Cossacks combined with other people who are connected with the Russian Empire, plausible deniability by the Tsar himself. The Tsar himself says, I'm not connected with these pogroms, they're awful. But in fact, the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church is often involved. Sometimes the Greek Orthodox Church is involved. There are attacks on Jews that leads to many violence committed on rapes and things like that that send people out. The 1881 Alexander II is assassinated. 1882 are the May laws, which are designed to respond to this. And in the May laws of 1882, and basically May of 1882, establishes that Jews can't own property anywhere near where the grain is coming out. Jews can't there's only a tiny number of Jews that are allowed to enter university. The very, very, very top students, and the rest cannot even attend university. Everything has to be in Russian. You can't speak Yiddish. No Ukrainian. There's a bunch of other things that are connected. May laws are actually a huge collection of things. But around the time of the May laws and after, you do see more pogroms. And again, the pogroms are they're a little bit like the violence in the South, which is sort of self-organized. It's a little bit like the sort of violence against other people that you see with the lynchings and things like that in the American South, but we do see more of them after 1882, and more blaming of Jews for all sorts of things, including claims that Jews are using children's Christian blood to make matzah and all sorts of other things. So does that make sense? So pogroms are taking place in this Russian Empire in the 1870s forward. They're not directly connectable to the Tsar, but they're very, very likely connected to activities of the Tsar. And they do increase after the May laws in 1882, in part because Jews can't fight back. Jews have fewer and fewer resources in the Russian Empire after May of 1882. Okay. A great question, though. So this is Russia. It's not an awesome place to live. I would have to say, with some my wife and others with ancestors in Russia. I have to say they were not fans of the Russian Empire. Okay. But as I said, Russia was regarded by European states and the empires as half civilized. And ultimately, the role of gunboats, though, would tip the balance away from European hegemony over the rest of the world, starting around 1904. And from 1904 to 1914, the period up to World War I, we see European states using increasingly these empires for their proxy wars. And a proxy war, if you've heard that expression before, proxy war is basically where you use another state to fight your war for you. So an example of a proxy war is, say, Vietnam, where you have the Chinese in North Vietnam and the Americans in South Vietnam fighting each other. There's not a direct conflict between China and the United States. There's not a shooting war, but Vietnam, the fighting in Vietnam is a proxy war for a conflict between China and the United States. Afghanistan in the 1980s. The U.S. is backing the Afghan rebels. Russia is supporting the Afghan state, and it's a sort of a proxy war. Angola in the 1980s and 90s, Nigeria in the 1990s are basically places where states are using other states to fight their wars. Angola is a fight between the United States and the Soviet Union, but using sort of rebels and counter rebels in that conflict. Similarly, a proxy war is in Nicaragua and places like that. So the Contras. So this is a proxy war. There are proxy wars that are going on from, say, 1904 to 1914 as European states are increasingly using these other empires, Russian, Ottoman, and Qing empires, to kind of fight their wars with each other. Does that make sense? So a proxy war is where you use someone else to fight your wars for you. Russian expansion into Asia, as the Russian Empire expands into Asia, it's funded by French bondholders. And so the French themselves, France has been defeated by Germany in 1871, 70-71. The French recover, their emperor is gone. France is now a republic, and they've got lots of dollars to invest in, lots of regular citizens who have dollars to invest, and they invest in Russian expansion into Asia. And here's Russia's plan from 1878, say, to 1914. The plan is to expand all the way through the Russian area, and this is where we're back. Remember, we're talking about the United States here, but basically Russia wants to be a United States. But what it doesn't have is a port that's a deep water port that's accessible. And so it builds this railroad that costs as much as 5 to 10 times as much as the Central Pacific Railroad. This massive, incredibly expensive railroad is built through Russia, through Siberia, all the way to China, or all the way towards China. And then after the Sino-Japanese War, they build this little feeder line in through Manchuria, and then this orange line all the way down to Dalian, which was then called Port Arthur. And it's basically supposed to be Russia's deep water port. The result is that Russia is going to be a competitor to the United States. That's their plan. All sorts of grain is going to be produced up here in Siberia. The grain is going to be exported and go out this port and be sold in China, in Japan, the Pacific generally, over to Latin America and elsewhere. And so Russia's plan is to become a sort of United States in a certain sense. Lots of peasants are going to be moved into these regions. The landlord system is going to continue, though. The nobility is going to get the best land. They're going to grow wheat and export it. That's their plan. And it's funded by this massive, incredibly expensive railroad system that goes all the way to China. Okay, now this gets more and more formalized. Russia's relationship with um, France gets more and more formalized over time. Right? It's the Nouveau Silk Road. It's a little bit like I would say it's a little bit like the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is a very similar kind of incredibly expensive plan to straddle the world by land. Um, and yeah, it's lots of things can go wrong. Okay, so it's important to understand, and a lot of diplomatic historians don't understand that this really starts around 1878. This relationship, and the relationship between Russia and France becomes tighter and tighter, so that in dollars, 19th century dollars, Russia owes about $1 billion to France by, say, 1904, 1905. $1 billion is owed to France for this railroad system. And it's going to be paid for by the grain. It's going to be paid for, as with the taxes and the shipping of this grain and stuff like that. But it's going to take 20, 25, 30 years for this thing to happen. Okay. Now, here's where we get to World War One. This is how Germany sees the Russia's alliance with France. Germany, which has kind of been created in a way. Germany's been around for a long time, but the sort of German Empire, quote unquote, starts around 1871 after the defeat of France. So you've got the German Empire, which is the sort of gray here. This is a cartoon in Germany. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is down here. That's the yellow. And as you can see, they feel that they're being surrounded, threatened by France, which is militaristic here on the left side, and Russia, which is about to gobble them up. This is the story that Germany has. It's a weird alliance between France and Russia if you think about it. You have autocratic Russia, incredibly hierarchical, and democratic France. But Germany feels threatened by this. Germans and Austro-Hungarians hate the increasingly visible alliance between democratic France and autocratic Russia. They see themselves as surrounded. And Germany then begins to establish closer relationships with Turkey in response, the Ottoman Empire, that is, believing the Ottoman Empire to be in trouble from these zones of influence from France and Britain and Russia, all of which want to take pieces of the Ottoman Empire. And so Germany forms a closer and closer relationship with the Ottoman Empire and defends it. They fund loans to build railroads all the way through the Middle East. And this is a little hard to imagine, so I want to show you this picture. This is the Berlin-Baghdad Expressway, all right? And so this is a kind of counter railroad. This is a railroad that Berlin is going to extend all the way through Turkey with bonds. Turkey's going to fund these bonds. It's going to be paid off by the Ottoman Public Debt Association. And it's going to be another massive railroad system that's going to connect Berlin all the way to the Middle East. Okay? And this is going to give Germany another path, so they've established closer relationship with Turkey in response. Or the Ottoman Empire in the response, and to help the Ottomans fend off the danger from France, Britain, as well as Russia, which want to take and so there are these. This is part of the issue. And look at Russia over here. It's got grain is coming out of Odessa, and it's got to come through the Straits of Turkey, which it very much objects to. Russia had been interested in taking Istanbul, which is Constantinople in this image, Istanbul right around here, all the way back to the ages of Peter the Great and before. And so all of them are, when people say that Ottoman Empire is a sick man of Europe, it's not really that sick, but it is being sort of devoured by European states in this port. And Germany says, if we're surrounded, if we've got France on one side of us, an expansive Russia on another side of us, the only way to protect ourselves is to tighten our relationship with Turkey. They fund loans to build railroads all the way through the Middle East. They also sell artillery and machine guns to Turkey to defend Istanbul from attack by Bulgaria, Serbia. Let's see, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, which is down here, and Italy, all of which want to take a piece of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, let's step back a little bit and say, who hates this? Who would fear this relationship? Who would be troubled by a line that goes from Berlin all the way to Baghdad? Who would be concerned about potentially gunboats and artillery lined up inside Turkey? Okay, the British. Why would the British be uncomfortable about that? What would Britain lose by having a stronger Turkey or a stronger Ottoman Empire? What do they have what's the danger for the Brits? It's not just that they don't like it, it's that they fear it, but what do they fear? What do the British fear, for example? Okay, overtaking the Suez Canal. So let's go back to that image here. You've got the Suez Canal. That allows you to connect Britain through here to India over here. And so an expansive Ottoman Empire might actually be able to take back this Egypt that had previously been under its control. Exactly. As E-Page says there, these zones of control that Britain have are potentially threatened if the Germans can send an army right away into, or even the Turks can send an army right away into the Middle East when Britain has to go by water. I'll lose control of their holdings. Yes, as they try to expand, the Ottomans and Brits shared some valuable trade commodity. Ottomans and Brits do share some trade. Yes, it is true. They have a stronghold of the Rock of Gibraltar. That's right. And so we think about Britain. It's got power. Remember, it controls those little islands. So it's got the Rock of Gibraltar. It's got the other islands in the Middle East. So there's that. Who else? So also, this is Italy. Right? This is, sorry, I'm covering the, the image here, but this pink line, I'm just going to move this up so that you can see it. This pink area is Italy controlled. So Italy controlled Libya. It takes it over in 1911. The French control Algeria, right? And so these institutions are these colonies, or they're called zones of influence, but they're really colonies of those countries, are potentially threatened if the Ottomans can send an army over and retake them. Right? They've been taken, or the control of them has been effectively turned over to the Europeans. But there's a possibility that the Ottomans can get it back. There's also the possibility that a German alliance with the Ottoman Empire could mean that German forces, who are the most powerful army in Europe at this point, might also help the Ottoman Empire take those regions. So does this make sense? What the threat here, the danger here? Okay. And so that's World War I then. What World War I is a relationship between Germany, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria, that basically this is what becomes the Central Powers. Okay, very quickly, a little bit about what's going on in Turkey. Turkey is changing. As I said, it's not just cracking the cake of culture like Bagehot says. The Young Turks emerge. They sort of take over from Abdul Hamid in the Ottoman Empire. With the help of Germany, using partly German artillery, German autocars, and other sorts of things, they take over the Ottoman Empire and replace it with a kind of modern Turkey, more or less. The 31 March incident is an incident in which the Ottomans use, you see up here, the machine guns to fight off a kind of weird coalition of supporters of the old regime, Islamists, liberals, and non-Turkish nationalists. After this, there's even more artillery and things like that that are based in artillery that are based in Istanbul. There's a campaign to purchase a battleship. Remember, a battleship is a crucial instrument here, roughly $2 million, and it's actually paid for by private subscriptions. And it's built in the Vickers shipyard. It's a British ship, and it's more powerful than any Russian ship. So remember that the Russians are also concerned about the power of Germany, because this German connection between Germany and Turkey could potentially wound them, and that's why Russia is on the Allied forces' side. And so this Turkish battleship is supposed to be delivered in June of 1914. Russia is concerned that this single battleship will be able to wipe out the Russian fleet on the Black Sea, just like the U.S. ships in Spain did in 1898, remember? And just like the Japanese did to the Russians in 1904. And then Providence falls into Russia's hands. They want a reason to fight with Turkey. They want a reason to fight with Germany. And they find it with the assassination. When Gavrilo Princip assassinates Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. When this happens, it's a way to build an alliance to defeat Turkey's financial alliance with Germany. But in the end, as I've suggested, Britain has had a great navy, but it's terrible at amphibious landings. We often talk about the battlefields in France and Germany, but the really important battlefield is at Gallipoli, when Britain believes that it can, because Turkey is so uncivilized, that Britain can simply land in the Dardanelles, take over Istanbul, and build a relationship with Russia, build a kind of strengthen the relationship between Allied forces and Central Powers. If you think about this, the Black Sea is critical to sending Russian wheat to France and Great Britain to fight this war. Yeah, there were a lot of alliance pacts, but a lot of those alliance pacts I want to suggest are financial. Have a lot to do with financial and kind of global issues. So they landed the Dardanelles in what's called the Gallipoli campaign, which is a terrible failed campaign that takes an entire year from 1914 to 1915. From 1915 to 1916, February of 1915 to January of 1916. And in the end, the Ottomans defeat, the Turkish state, with the German alliance, defeats the British. We'll talk about how both Germany and France and Great Britain starve for wheat because the Gallipoli campaign prevents them from having access to grain, and how the United States gets drawn into this once the American wheat becomes more and more essential to French and British success in World War I. Sorry, a whirlwind tour about the beginnings of World War I, slightly different, focused in a way on the United States, focused on railroads, focused on these peculiar alliances. We'll talk more later. Sorry to go a little bit over. Thanks so much, and I guess you can go back to the news, because there are a couple things that are happening today that might be interesting to you. See you guys on Friday, where we'll talk about gay New York. As you can see, the readings don't connect all that directly to our readings. Thanks, everybody. See you guys soon.